Girija Madam, respected Kailash sir, good afternoon, senior delegates, friends. Would like to sincerely thank Madam and sir for giving me this opportunity. Thanks, MedPurpose, for coordinating everything. So over the next 40 minutes, that's what I was told. I will just ponder upon this simple topic, diabetes made simple. So I have done this topic in such a way like this is absolutely, there are no conflicts of interest. So just because we are moving, we are no pharma industry is there, we will just speak simple science. That is the objective of this talk. We'll just see as much as possible. I will just keep it as much simple as possible on the management of diabetes. Just give me a minute, please. Okay. Yeah. So there are so many studies. If you see, like there are so many big. We will just over the first next 10 minutes, we will just see simple three concepts that we need to learn, that we need to understand. I'll just make it clear. Then we will move on to this pharmacotherapies, how we can manage in a very simple way in our clinical practice. So the first concept that we all need to know is, there are so many studies like UKPDS study, which was done in drug-naive people. The average age of the people were about 53 years. What they tried to do was, by various pharmacotherapies, they tried to bring the HbA1c from 7.9 to 7. At the end of the study, there was a follow-up study which was published in 2006. So we'll just keep it aside. At the end of the study, UKPDS, there was no major macrovascular benefit, but there was some microvascular benefit. So no CV event by treating diabetes, we were able to establish in drug-naive people by bringing the HbA1c from 8 to 7. ACCORD trial is one trial which was robustly conducted, about 12,000 people. They were all high-risk diabetes, age about 62 years. They tried to bring the HbA1c to less than 6 by various means. They were aggressively treating the people and tried to bring the HbA1c as low as possible, just like a normal. But at the end of the study, what they knew was it was associated with high risk of mortality in ACCORD trial. BADT is also almost a similar trial where the HbA1c they tried to bring from 8.4 to 6.9. There was no micro, no mass, as well as no macrovascular benefit. ACCORD proved worst mortality, whereas BADT study showed there was no improved outcome. Advanced trial in the intensive arm where gliclazide was used, again tried to bring the HbA1c from 7.3 to 6.5. There was some benefit with respect to nephropathy, but there was no benefit with respect to retinopathy. There was no benefit with respect to macrovascular events or concern. There was no heart-related ailments or a stroke or a CV events was getting benefited even in the advance. So if you see all these huge mega trials which were conducted till 2010, by treating diabetes, there was some benefit with respect to microvascular event, but there was no benefit with respect to the macrovascular events. So diabetes, when we mean by diabetics, we need to understand the first concept that we need to drive is diabetes is not for CV risk reduction. So this we need to understand. By treating the diabetes, we are not trying to reduce the CV events by any means. So there is the first thing that we need to know. So there is the evidence-based medicine is something new, which as clinicians, we are not taking up in a bigger way. There are lots of cardiovascular outcome trials, especially like if you see like evidence-based medicine tries to put together the patient values. What does it mean? Our clinical expertise. There are lots of publications which happens over there, and it tries to conglomerate everything and give as a summary. So what is good for our patient? The problem with us is we rely upon this clinical expertise. We are all clinical expertise, like we have been treating patients for so many days. We have patient values, but we don't put all this best research evidence in our practice. So the idea is to learn about all these evidences or the research which are happening so that we can extrapolate all these things to our patients. There are few drugs, like I will just quote one drug by name sibutramine. So sibutramine is one drug which was banned in 2010, which is an excellent drug for weight reduction. But US FDA said no to this drug in spite of showing a good reduction in weight reduction. The reason being, the weight reduction which was happening with sibutramine didn't get extrapolated as CV event reduction at all. So if weight reduction happens, the patient should improve in their morbidity or in the mortality just by reducing weight. What is happening? So it means that there is some underlying event which was happening over there, or it was some therapeutic disadvantage, or the drug is not good where weight reduction was happening, but it was not getting extrapolated as a CV benefit event at all. So the drug was banned. It was all because of the publications that happened. Now as clinician, like we see so many opinions about so many molecules keep popping us. So when we look into all those things, always they look at reduction of glucose, reduction of lipid. But by reducing the glucose, does it get extrapolated as CV event or not? So by reducing the sugar, because we saw like diabetes itself is not about reducing CV event. So our drugs should not cause any undue harm to the patient. That is the second message that we need to know. So for which we need to have cardiovascular outcome trial. Some drugs, like, you know, like there are some diabetic molecules which are hitting the molecule. So like, let us say fenofibrate. Fenofibrate doesn't have any CV outcome trial at all. It showed that it didn't benefit at all. Like, let us take teneligliptin. A friend of mine who is a teacher in a big medical college said US FDA has approved. When I showed him that US FDA has not approved, he was surprised to see, because he was not updated. He was not using his evidence-based medicine data. So the thing is, like, molecules such as teneligliptin doesn't have a CV outcome trial. So we have to learn how to interpret this evidence-based medicine and how to read papers. Probably, like, if they give an opportunity, we can discuss about how to read papers and all in a simple way in a forthcoming session. So that is something like which we all have to know. And the point that we need to drive is, there are lots of CV outcome trials are happening with the molecules. Try to understand all those data, and we can take forward to those data to our patient. The third point that we want to drive is, when we said ACCORD trial was not showing any improvement in the CV events, rather it was showing an increase in the mortality. When you try to reduce the HbA1c to less than 6, what was happening was, there was increase in the mortality. More people were dying, more people were having CV events. So what could be the reason when the HbA1c was getting normalized? So there was one arm where the HbA1c was standard, like where the people were not aggressively treated, which is shown in the blue line over here. There was another arm over an orange line over here, like where the people were intensively treated. So what was happening was, people who had an initial HbA1c at their presentation, when we tried to treat them very, very aggressively, the moment the HbA1c was falling less than 7, the people were succumbing to more amount of illness than people who were averagely or in a standard arm treated. So the point that we drive is, so when we try to treat the people, say for about an year, you treat an individual with an aggressive medical therapy. We will come to that, all those things in the subsequent slides. So when you try to treat all these patients, just see whether the HbA1c comes down within an year or so. If the HbA1c comes down within a year, it was not associated with the increase in the mortality. If the HbA1c doesn't come down within a year, just leave the patients as such. So the point that ACCORD derived was very, very simple. When you try to treat the HbA1c, see to it that the HbA1c, desired HbA1c happens within first quarter, second quarter, or third quarter. If it happens with the third HbA1c, fine. If it doesn't happen within the third HbA1c, it means that we continue to aggressively treat the patients, whereby they are prone for more amount of hypoglycemic events, whereby the mortality increases. So the point that we derive here is individualize each patient. A HbA1c of 8.5 in an elderly patient of 70 years doesn't mean anything. So we don't need to run behind his HbA1c and try to push the HbA1c to 6, 7, saying that the CV events will decrease. If it doesn't come down with your aggressive management, just leave and accept. There are various factors why a HbA1c can be elevated in our people. There are genome-wise association studies which have shown where there are lots of molecular changes which bring about an aberrant changes in the A1C. So just because of your therapy, if you are not able to achieve the desired A1C with all means, don't disturb the patient. So we should not run behind the HbA1c. So these are the 3 points, 3 important concepts that we want you to take. The first point being that we are not treating the diabetics for CV reduction alone. And ACCORD trial very, very clearly showed that the mortality increases when we try to treat the HbA1c to a level less than 6 or so. So we are predisposing to our individuals to excess amount of hypoglycemia. We need to embrace cardiovascular outcome trial. So we'll just move on to some of the molecules. I will just try to make the important points in a simpler way, in an unbiased way, based on pure science. So when we try to give metformin, we can start metformin, say like a HbA1c of 8 or so. When we want to treat our individuals, the metformin dose can be 500 mg once or twice a day. If the HbA1c doesn't reduce, we have to move to the second molecule that we all know. But the dosaging of metformin most of the time has to be in the night. The reason being, metformin is typically associated with decrease in the hepatic glucose output. So we can give it BD, or say suppose a HbA1c of 7.4 or 7.5, you want to treat it. The dose of metformin has to be in the night so that the hepatic glucose output takes care, not in the daytime. So this is something like which we all should know. The metformin dose typically to start with has to be in the night. The second thing is, sometimes when our patients who are on metformin may complain of, like, there are some studies to show 20 to 30% of the time they may be coming with GI intolerance. When the patients have some GI intolerance in the form of a flatulence, in the form of burping sensation, or in the form of fullness in the stomach, always think about metformin intolerance in those people. So how else you can address these patients? You can just, if you are using a fixed drug combination in those patients, take metformin away from the fixed drug combination. So if you are using, say, a DPP4 inhibitor with metformin or a sulfonylurea with the metformin, take away metformin from that combination and try to use metformin in a different type of technology where it is being synthesized. So that typically, like, there are some flash trap technologies which are available for this preparation of metformin. There are some companies, I will just quote the name of the companies also over here, for product name also. Citapen and Carbophage are two metformin molecules, the brand names, where the synthesis of metformin itself is in a different way, where the GI intolerance comes down with these sort of preparations. So try to do that before you take away metformin from the patients. So should we give routine B12 supplements when we give metformin to our patients? So that is a very crucial question, because lots of studies show that metformin is associated with B12. So if you try to see just to measure B12, it may show that metformin is associated with B12 deficiency. But there are some studies where they try to correlate with methylmalonic acid quantitatively, like methylmalonic acid can be assessed. So when they try, methylmalonic acid is a substrate for a conversion, like where we can measure it. But the problem with methylmalonic acid quantitatively measuring is it is expensive. It is about 10,000. So it becomes very expensive for a clinical practice like ours. So we can't do that. So when we need to prove that whether the patient has got a B12 deficiency or not, or whether the metformin is causing a B12 deficiency or not, we have to see methylmalonic acid in the blood. So the studies based on methylmalonic acid completely disapprove this theory of metformin causing B12 deficiency. If there is some peripheral neuropathy, then you can give B12 supplements, but there is no data to show that every metformin patients should receive a B12 supplement. So there are some preparations which come 1 gram preparation, 300 mg in specific form, 700 mg in other form. There are IR preparations, SR preparations, XR preparations. Does it mean that XR preparations or SR preparations deliver the drug for a long time? So there is nothing like that. The amount of drug which is delivered, whether it is IR, XR or XR or whatever be the combination, is going to be the same, except that SR or XR is associated with lower incidence of GI intolerance. As we said over here, when you try to move from IR preparation to SR or XR, the GI intolerance comes down with metformin. The contraindication, is there any metformin contraindication? For all practical purposes, even in stage 4 or 5 CKDs, even on dialysis patients, there are some data to show that metformin helps. So the absolute contraindication, if there is anything for metformin, there is no contraindication at all, except the patients in ICU. The reason being, in ICUs, the amount of lactate production will be more because anaerobic metabolism takes over. So when there is an anaerobic metabolism, metformin also tries to physiologically slightly improve lactate production in the body. That is how metformin acts. So when physiologically also, like when a patient is in ICU, because of anaerobic metabolism, lactate production is increased, and metformin also causes slight increase in the production of lactate, then there might be an incidence of increase in lactate, which may predispose to lactic acidosis. Except that even with an GFR of 30 to 15, we can safely use nowadays metformin, and there are specific recommendations for that. So once we start the patients on metformin, so what should be the second drug that we have to use? Whether should we use sulfonylurea, whether we should use DPP4 inhibitors, whether we use SGLT2 inhibitors. We will just keep it very, very simple over here. So there are definite indications for SGLT2 inhibitors being used as a second drug. Suppose if a patient has got multiple CV risk factors, he's a smoker, he's on dyslipidemia, he has done an angiogram which shows a stable CAT, or he has been on an angioplasty, or he has an heart failure. In all these factors, the evidence currently shows that SGLT2 inhibitors are the best drug. So there are specific indications for SGLT2 inhibitors when there are multiple CV risk factors are there, or in the presence of an heart failure, or in the presence of an ACS certain or ACS happen. So in a secondary prevention. So in those cases, SGLT2 inhibitors are invariably, they should be the second drug. Except in those patients, we have to choose between DPP4 inhibitors and sulfonylureas. So DPP4 inhibitors and sulfonylureas, if you literally see whether DPP4 inhibitors, are they associated with a lesser incidence of hypoglycemia, sulfonylureas cause more hypoglycemia. If questions comes like that, the evidence says that DPP4 inhibitors are not associated with a decrease in the events of hypoglycemia. You take TCOS, you take any of the DPP4 inhibitors outcome study, there was no decrease in the incidence of hypoglycemia at all compared to the arm where sulfonylureas were used. So this we have to accept. But the advantage of DPP4 inhibitors over sulfonylurea is the ease of achieving an HbA1c without causing a clinical event. So what we mean by that is, so a patient who comes with an HbA1c of say like 8.2, and you want to treat him with metformin, metformin is not working, means it brings the HbA1c to say 7.5, and he is very young, you want to bring the HbA1c to 6.5 or 6.7. So what would be the drug over there? So for ease of use, for the efficacy, DPP-4 inhibitors score over there than sulfonylureas. So both of them act exactly the same mechanism. If you see the molecular wise mechanisms, almost they are, though they are incretin mediated pathway, how they act in the beta cells, it is all acting through the CMP mediated mechanism. So both of them have got exactly the same mechanism. But DPP-4 inhibitors are slightly better than sulfonylureas for ease of use of the patients. So of the DPP-4 inhibitors, what DPP-4 inhibitors we can use? We discussed earlier, teneligliptin is not a molecule which can be used in clinical practice, not only because of the QT prolongation. It doesn't have the CV outcome trial, and there are other safe molecules which are available for the same cost, which are much studied. So for this reason, I think teneligliptin we have to drop. Sitagliptin has got extensive, robust studies available. Linagliptin also has got extensive, robust studies available, but they are still priced costlier. So about 45 to 50 rupees they cost. And vildagliptin is one molecule which has become cheaper. So when we remove the other two molecules because of cost alone. So linagliptin, even in a dialysis patient, it has been studied. So the one single indication for linagliptin in most of our patients is patients who have a kidney disease. So very good. It is metabolized at the level of plasma, and it doesn't cause any drug accumulation. So it can be even used in dialysis patient. Sitagliptin has been robustly studied, but still the cost of these molecules is higher. So we can just take vildagliptin alone can be used by most of our patients. But the one concern about vildagliptin is always see to it, like even the labeling of vildagliptin says, the transaminases, if they are elevated, if the SGPT is say more than 80 to 120, don't use vildagliptin. And when you use vildagliptin, always keep monitoring SGPT also, so that there are some concerns about vildagliptin causing an increase in the transaminase level. So this is something which we should know. And typically, if you give once a day vildagliptin of 50 mg, will do the postprandial blood sugar for most of our patients. And I personally feel it need not be given twice a day. So there are various reasons why it is being projected, how the incretin activity comes, why should we address it twice a day. But for all practical purposes, for all clinicians, I feel vildagliptin can be very well given once a day for taking care of postprandial blood sugar, and 50 mg once a day will do. So what is the take on oglibose then? So we need to understand the pathophysiology of diabetes is not about increase in the absorption of carbohydrate from the intestine. So when we try to use oglibose, that is what we are trying to block. So it doesn't address the pathophysiology. So usage of oglibose, for the cost that is involved, we have to use it with a pinch of salt. If it is taken as a triple drug combination therapy, say metformin plus sulfonylurea plus oglibose, if a combination is available and it is cheaper, in those situations we can use. The isolated ogliboses are very expensive, and we have to use it with a pinch of salt. So when we use DPP-4 inhibitors, I personally feel we don't need to use another molecule to take care of the postprandial blood sugar. So we will use oglibose with some we are not so comfortable using oglibose in isolatedly for the cost involved. So when it comes to sulfonylurea, sulfonylureas are extensive molecule, very well studied, very good studies are available. We cannot treat diabetes without sulfonylurea. Of these sulfonylureas, which sulfonylurea can be chosen? So gliclazide is the most studied and the very good molecule available among all these sulfonylureas. It is almost as good as a DPP-4 inhibitor. 60 mg half dose you give in the place of any of the DPP-4 inhibitors, it will have exactly the same effect. So it will produce a very good control in blood sugar. There won't be any hypoglycemia. The tolerance of the molecule is very good, and extensive studies in advanced studies it was used, and there are many good studies available. And this is the most studied molecule also. So glycoside is the preferred sulfonylurea among these three things. But we need to understand glycoside is the most cheapest and underused molecule. Not that every other patients, they are costlier, glycoside. So not that every other patient has to be given a glimepiride or glycoside. Glycoside are very cheapest and very underused. And as far as the HbA1c is concerned, they are almost the same. But the thing is, they were started using like 70s, 80s, they started to the clinical use. So we don't have robust data over there. But still, as far the usage is concerned, as far the HbA1c reduction is concerned, glycoside are fantastic molecules and they are cheapest, and we don't use it much. We need to use, except like renal patients, because of its short half-life, we try to use glycoside. But I feel like glycoside is the should be very used molecule, especially people who are not affordable. Glycoside is a molecule which we must take in a bigger way. Glimepiride is the most potent of all. That is one reason why it may be associated with a higher incidence of hypoglycemia. Whenever we talk about sulfonylurea and hypoglycemia, we always attribute it to hypoglycemia, because they are potent molecule. If the HbA1c is 9 and if you put the patient on metformin plus glimepiride, definitely the HbA1c reduction will happen, which we all have been seeing for ages together. So this is the potent of all. So when let us say, like, if the HbA1c is 8 and we want to use, we can choose glycoside. If the HbA1c is 9, we can use glimepiride. So but glimepiride has got more amount of hypoglycemia compared to glycoside. So that is one negative aspect, but they are the potent of all. So this is our take on sulfonylureas. SGLT2 inhibitors, as we said, there are specific indications for using SGLT2 inhibitors. And after metformin, we can use a DPP4 inhibitors or sulfonylurea. Once we have used either a DPP4 or a sulfonylurea, I think if the patient is affordable, the third molecule can be an SGLT2 inhibitors. SGLT2 inhibitors, we will just remove this remogliflozin for the reason it again doesn't have a CV outcome data, and it is as expensive as other SGLT2 inhibitors. So of these three SGLT2 inhibitors, we have empagliflozin, canagliflozin, and dapagliflozin. Dapagliflozin is associated only and decrease in the events of heart failure. Somehow with repeated studies, it didn't, this heart failure reduction was not associated with reduction in the mortality or CV events. So what we mean by is, heart failure can happen. Heart failure may be becoming less with the dapagliflozin, and it has been studied even in non-diabetic patients. But the problem is whether by the reduction of this heart failure, are we able to reduce the CV events or not? So that sort of data is not available somehow for dapagliflozin. So we will just remove dapagliflozin. We are left with empagliflozin and canagliflozin. There was some concern about canagliflozin when this molecule we started using way back in 2016, like the CANVAS trial came, and the CANVAS trial said that it was associated with the increase in the incidence of lower limb amputations. So that was the one skeptical reason we were not using canagliflozin much, but there are too much of studies which are being done now. The observation which was observed with the canagliflozin over there in the CANVAS study, we had in empagliflozin also, there was some fracture risk, but it was happening in the upper limb. So SGLT2 inhibitors per se may be associated with slight increase in the incidence of fractures. So that we have to take it with a pinch of salt. But is it something which is unique to canagliflozin? Has been addressed by US FDA recently, a week back, saying that after looking into the robust data that is available with canagliflozin, it is as good as empagliflozin. So the heart failure, the CV risk even, the CV events, the mortality benefit, everything is concerned. So empagliflozin and canagliflozin are almost the same as far as the recommendations are concerned. So we can choose one over the other. When it comes to the cost, say if you are using an empagliflozin, always know that it is very expensive, say 50-55 rupees. So when we want to use empagliflozin, always ask the patient to take it as 25 mg and they can score it, whereby the cost becomes exactly off and becomes affordable to most of the patients. If you want to take 10 mg, it may cost about 40 to 45 rupees. That is the therapeutic dose that we use. So instead, we can ask them to purchase 25 mg and make them to get scored, whereby like they will be taking 12.5 mg, and that is one way of seeing. Or we can use it with the metformin, where the cost reduction happens. There are empagliflozin associated with metformin, which is available for less than 30 rupees. So as far the cost is concerned, it is expensive, and we can educate our patients how the cost reduction can happen. So the second thing is we have to educate our patients, because the SGLT2 inhibitors are associated with increase in the incidence of fungal infection and urinary tract infection. Especially this is more pronounced among Indian males, the Caucasian males, especially the Western population, because of Sunnat and other things, the urinary tract infections are not much pronounced over there. Whereas in Indian patients, male patients, we are seeing more amount of urinary tract infection and fungal infections. Especially this happens even after 5 to 6 months of using the drug without any side effects. So in that case, we may not be, even with a heart failure, we are not able to use. So we have to educate the patients how they have to retract their foreskin, and the need to keep their glands clean every day after they urinate is one thing that we need to educate. And all the glucose that gets excreted through the urine, that is how the SGLT2 inhibitors. So we have to educate our patients to take more amount of water, so that the SGLT2 inhibitors work well and the glucose gets excreted through the urine. So GLP-1 based therapy, as we move, it is completely no for a general practitioners. I think we can manage our diabetic patients with these oral molecules, 1 metformin, 2 DPP-4 or sulfonylurea, 3 SGLT. If it is not getting controlled, the next thing has to be insulin. GLP-1 based therapies are too much for us, we don't need. And always remember that GLP-1 based therapies are associated with unexplained increase in the transaminases level. And there are some cardiovascular outcome trial which was associated, GLP-1 based therapy are associated with increase in the incidence of gallbladder cancer and pancreatic cancer. So which significantly increased. It is not just hearsay. The companies don't project all these data. So they are associated with cholangiocarcinoma and pancreatic carcinoma, which are very expensive for a normal person. So don't get into this trap, and always use this molecule with a little bit of caution. So when it comes insulin, we will just put it very simple. Only 2 insulins are needed for most of our patients. 95% of the patients we can just treat with these 2 insulins. One is the basal insulin. When we mean by basal insulin, it is glargine, or the normal premix insulins are sufficient for most of the patients. So if you see the insulin talks, typically when we attend in conferences, they always say like severe hypoglycemia. This is from NEJM, glargine and degludec. When we try to compare the mean number of episodes per patient, they will say, oh, this much amount of thing. And relative risk is, so much. P-value so much. Confidence interval so much. Everything, if you see it with a scientific eye, they will project the data as if like every other patient is going to land up with the hypoglycemia. So we need to understand there is something called as relative risk and something called as absolute risk reduction. Relative risk is comparing between 2 arms. So there might be, in one study, there might be 2 events. In another study, there might be just 3 events. So if you see the relative difference between these 2 studies, it is about 33%, isn't it? So it will show as a very bloated value. But if you see the absolute risk reduction, so really if you treat 100 patients, how many of them are going to land up with 1 episode of hypoglycemia? The number will be going to be very less. So in the similar study, if you treat 40 patients for 100 years, 40 patients for 100 years, not like they might be using insulin for 30 years only. So only if you treat these patients for 100 years, you can reduce 1 incidence of hypoglycemia. So 40 patients for 100 years, you can reduce 1 incidence of hypoglycemia. That too, how the hypoglycemia can define? It is not a severe hypoglycemia. It is a hypoglycememia which can be easily corrected with the patient can walk into the kitchen and take some snacks and he feels get corrected. So it is not an objective hypoglycemia. It is a subjective hypoglycemia. It is not a severe hypoglycemia. So this is how the data, if you see, it will get bloated, it will get projected in a bigger way, because the amount of money an industry or a insulin maker invests to produce one insulin is about 1 billion crore. 1 billion crore. So see the amount of money that is involved. So they will try to tell with all these data saying that one is superior over the other. They will try to not to sell the insulin also, which were available earlier, so that everybody can get moved to the newer insulin, all these things. So if you clinically see, all that the patient need is, if at all, the first insulin that has to be used, that can be Glargine. If the blood sugar is very high, all that we need to do is a simple premixed insulin like Mixtard will do for most 95 to 96% of our patients. Even I can say 98% of the patients, they don't need anything more than this. So let us keep aside all other fancy insulins. So we will just quickly move on to the last. Sir, are we having 5 minutes, sir, or should we cut down, sir?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
5 minutes. Yes, sir. So yeah. So as we see the last 4 slides, one thing that we need to understand is, when a diabetic patient comes to our clinical practice, apart from treating all the diabetes things, one thing which we need to understand is, there is a CVE1 happening because of the macrophage Laden depositions happening over here, which can be stimulated by oxygen stress, which happens with the diabetes, or because of smoking, or because of an increase in the LDL. So this is one reason why in a patient with the diabetic, so in an isolated hypercholesterolemic patients with an 160 without hypertension, without any other risk factor, we don't need to treat an LDL of 160. But if a diabetic patient comes with an LDL of even 100, it is very, very important to keep the LDL as low as possible, so that we can prevent an CVE1. So even 100 has to be used with caution. So there is a caution which has to be told about fibrate. There are 2 studies on fenofibrate. Both the studies, including AIM-HIGH and the other study, both the studies showed fenofibrate was not associated with any increase in the survival of the individual, or it didn't decrease the mortality at all. So rather, when the fenofibrate was used, the eGFR of most of the patients were improving. Then the people were followed up for 5 years. In the people who were given fenofibrate, the eGFR was falling by about 20. From 95, it was falling to 75 to 70 because of usage of fenofibrate. In an acute event, we all know, like when the GFR increases, when we give fenofibrate, and when the GFR is increased, or when the creatinine is increased, when the GFR decreases, we have to stop fenofibrate. This point we all know. In an acute event, they are potent drugs to cause AKI. But what we are driving here is, in a patients who have been inadvertently, say if the triglyceride is about 250, 300, we don't need to treat that. Just to give statins alone, that will do for most of our patients. They don't need fenofibrate at all. So in a 250 or 300, all that it needs is, we have to find out the reason for his hypertriglyceridemia, whether his glucose intake is higher, whether his diabetes is getting adequately controlled, is he a hypothyroid, is he on any beta blockers, is he consuming any excess amount of alcohol, or his HbA1c is higher. Look into all these modifiable factors, and if his carbohydrate intake is higher, try to reduce that. That is what is important in all the patients. Just don't put something like Rosubas, Tonac, TG, all these things. So all these fibrates, most of our patients doesn't require. When we should use fibrate in our patients? Only when the triglyceride is more than 500, just to prevent a pancreatic calculi to happening because of an increase in the hypertriglyceridemia. And that is the only situation that we need to treat this triglycerides. Apart from that, we don't need to treat hypertriglyceridemia at all. The next most important thing is, when you see the modifiable various risk factors, Even before our diabetes comes over, what is important is how much are we able to treat our blood pressure. So blood pressure monitoring is very, very important for all our patients. So if blood pressure is more than 140/90, the target for all the patients, except for elderly patients, blood pressure must be treated. If there is a proteinuria, it is AS or ARB, preferably ARB should be the first drug. If there is no proteinuria, most of our patient needs is CCB. Well-studied molecule is amlodipine. There are too many dipines now available in the market, benidipine, this dipine, that dipine. They are all not studies. No CVOTs. Don't fall trap for all these newer molecules. So the third drug has to be a diuretic. So this is the simplest protocol for BP reduction. One thing that when we screen our patients, what is very, very important is this urine albumin creatinine ratio. So don't ask for simple microalbuminuria in our patients. Microalbuminuria can happen when you sit and stand, it can happen. If you do go for a brisk walking and check for your urine, there can be some proteinuria which can be picked up as a microalbuminuria. Don't ask for a simple albuminuria or a microalbuminuria testing. So which is not the right way of checking. Rather, we should ask urine albumin creatinine ratio or urine protein creatinine ratio. For 1 gram of creatinine which is getting excreted, for 1 milligram of creatinine which is getting excreted in the urine, how much amount of protein or how much amount of albumin is getting excreted. That is how you can quantitatively and objectively say whether the patient is having a renal events or not. And also, whenever we measure a creatinine, just see EGFR is very, very important in our patients. EGFR calculators are available. Just put AHX, weight, ethnicity. So EGFR comes. So we should try to document as an EGFR. And whenever we see the renal outcome, so the complications has to be screened with urine albumin creatinine ratio, not by asking a simple proteinuria. The last slide of the day, I will come. Most of our patients, including some of the doctors, are very happy about all these diets. There are big conferences even happening among doctors on keto diet, paleo diet, all these things. So what we need to understand is all these diet patterns, whether it is a keto diet, paleo diet, or an Atkins diet, what is happening is everything will finally, whether you take a keto diet or paleo diet, you try to reduce low carbohydrate and increase more amount of fat. So when you do that, the body gets initially cheated. It is not getting directly from the carbohydrate, the energy. So whatever, like whether it is a fat or a carbohydrate, it is the acetyl-CoA that is getting converted. But the body gets cheated by this conversion that the energy is coming from fatty acids, not from the carbohydrate. So initially you can see that just because of a shift in the source of the fluid, people may lose weight, people may have a good glycemic control, they may stop all the medications. Everything is fantastic. But what we need to understand is whether it is a carbohydrate or fat, finally what is happening is acetyl-CoA is the one which gets produced. So over a period of time, the body understands this cheat mechanism and it doesn't respond. So all these diets are nonsense. If at all, if we want to do some dieting for our patients, it should be an intermittent fasting state. Intermittent fasting is something where we fast for 12 to 16 hours. All the 2 meals like which we consume has to be taken within 8 hours, so that when we fast, lot of keto acids gets produced, and these keto acids are a very good substrate as an alternative source of energy for muscles, for heart, as well as for the brain. So that is what most of our patients need to know. So that happens with intermittent fasting, not by this simple cheat mechanism where like when we shift one source of energy to another source of energy. Rather, it should be an intermittent fasting, like where we try to take the food within 8 hours and we give a gap of 16 hours. There is no energy at all coming to the body, and the keto acids gets produced as a substrate for the brain, heart, and muscles. So this is something which we all should know about intermittent fasting. With this, I conclude. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.